So, good evening and welcome. My name is Carrie Penabad, and I'm the Associate Dean and Director of the undergraduate program here at the University of Miami School of Architecture. With the arrival of Dean El-Khoury in 2014, the University of Miami School of Architecture launched the Techno-Glass Lecture Series, which is a public program that includes lectures, interviews, mini symposia, and exhibitions, all curated around an annual theme that is of particular relevance to the school. The inaugural series, titled Call to Order, Sustaining Simplicity in Architecture, and suggesting a regrouping and regrounding upon the foundations of the discipline, celebrates the history of the school while clarifying its renewed purpose in an international arena. Tonight is a very special night, for we are celebrating the Call to Order book launch, as well as having the opportunity to listen to Jorge Silvetti, whose work is also featured in the book, speak on the topic of type and history within the context of contemporary architectural practice, two themes that I would argue are central to the publication. First and foremost, I would like to thank Dean El-Khoury for the opportunity to edit the first volume, and to the many colleagues who collaborated on the book, including Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, Roberto Bear, Edgar Sarli, Stephen Fett, Jean-François Lejeune, Catherine Wheeler, Jaime Correa, and Adib Gure. I would also like to thank Jorge Hernandez and Teofilo Victoria for their critical insights and continued engagement. Thanks must go to Technoglass, whose generous sponsorship makes both the lecture series and the production of this book possible. I would also like to thank Oscar Riera Ojeda and Max Guerra from Oro Publishers for their collaboration and their dedication to the design and production of the book. And finally, I would like to thank my fantastic teaching assistants, Aijerem Amirova, Sophie Genoux, Claire Morris, and Minna Shim-Roth, for their energy, enthusiasm, and insights. This book is the first in a series of books, the second of which is currently being edited by Alan Schulman on the topic of the tropical world. We hope that these publications will serve as both a reference and a repository of the intellectual discussions and creative projects currently taking place at the school. To return briefly to the Call to Order publication, the book was inspired by Rappel à l'Ordre, the post-World War I European art movement that rejected the extreme tenets of the avant-garde and its praise of machinery, violence, and war in favor of continuity and rational sobriety. Call to Order suggests a regrouping and a regrounding upon the foundations of the discipline and examines an international group of architects that seem reinvested in restraint, simplicity, history, typology, and rational order, but without holding on to disciplinary autonomy. They build upon enduring foundations, but only to project architecture in an expanded and enriched territory. The book surveys this contemporary condition in the context of a long historical trajectory to tease out and articulate a cultural project that is relevant to the ongoing architectural debate. The dialogue generated by both the production of the book and the events that took place alongside it have been thoughtful, invigorating, and are ongoing. I believe that Jorge Silvetti's talk this evening will provide an expanded platform for the discussion and a deepening of the conversation. Having said that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you this evening Professor Jorge Silvetti, who alongside his partner, Rodolfo Machado, have been among the most influential teachers, critical thinkers, and dynamic practitioners in the field of architecture for over 4 decades. I, like many gathered here in this room, have had the privilege to have been their student and later a collaborator in their architectural practice. I am grateful to Jorge and to Rodolfo for their mentorship and for their continued passion and commitment to the discipline. Jorge has been a faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Design since 1975. In 1990, he was appointed the Distinguished Nelson Robison Jr. Professor of Architecture, and between 1995 and 2002, he served as the chair of the Department of Architecture. Alongside his impressive academic career, Jorge was a founding partner with Rodolfo Machado of the internationally recognized firm of Machado Silvetti. I was a graduate student at the GSD during Jorge's tenure as chair and vividly recall Jorge's dynamic presence and impact on the institution through both his writings and his buildings. Earlier this month, Jorge was awarded the Topaz Medallion, the highest honor bestowed on an academic by the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. In his keynote address, Jorge explored the current state of contemporary architectural education within a longer historical trajectory. He ended with a presentation of some of his recent studios at Harvard. These studios underscored the importance of shaping a contemporary architectural pedagogy that embraced the knowledge afforded to us by other disciplines, but where the engagement and design of works of architecture was inescapable. I believe that this sentiment will also resonate in tonight's lecture, as any conversation centered on type is inevitably a conversation centered on the nature of architecture itself. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jorge Silvetti.
Thank you, Carrie. That was a beautiful introduction. And thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Miami. And even was a great pleasure to come back to Miami last year, but in Rome, changing the location. Just to add one note on one of the motives of motivations for this gathering tonight, which is the presentation of the book. That's a great book. It's really a very beautiful book and a very well thought out book. And, leaving aside that our work is included there, I think it is a well-conceived book at this moment that speaks through architecture, so very well chosen topics and projects. And we actually, Rodolfo and I, received a copy that we think from you, from the school a few months ago. We like it so much that we in an act of generosity with a very good friend from architecture, we gave it to him, because we thought it was so good that he will appreciate that from Europe. So I have to ask for another copy. But what I want to talk tonight has this very long title. And let me just, I am going to need some light. I already discussed it with Ray, because I'm going to read. That's the only way that keeps me more or less on time. So not all the lights will go out, but can you see well? Yeah, I guess you do. And I'm going to also sit. And where do I, oh, here from the computer, I manage this. Okay, I think I'm ready. So a little bit about what I'm about to present tonight to you. It was originally crafted, the first version of this, in November last year to be presented as an homage in a memorial event held at Harvard, a memory of Edward Seckler, who passed away last April at the age 96, and for which the school had chosen me to prepare and deliver such lecture. He was a dear friend. He came to the school until the very end, even though he was retired and was part of our lives. We missed him greatly. But at that moment, when confronted with the honor I received to represent Harvard in such an event, together with the responsibility of honoring someone of his stature, I decided that the best and honest way to go about it was to attempt to transmit, through a series of thoughts, illustrations, and hypotheses, how architecture history actively and creatively works in the mind of a designer. This is an almost identical presentation with some expansion on some thoughts and topics and some additional new images. For all the discussion we've had in the last decades about the relationship of history of architecture and the practice of architecture, and in particular, what kind of history of architecture should be taught to future architects in a professional school, addressing that issue continues to be arduous, complex, and at times treacherous and confusing. It helped, interestingly, that this struggle that I had when I began to work on this lecture last year occurred at the propitious moment very apt to bring the discussion of the dynamics of architectural history and architectural practice into the school, because it happened in the midst of the unfolding second Chicago Architectural Biennial, which, as you know, was titled Make New History, and which defines as its objective, and I quote, to understand the channels through which architecture moves and is shaped in architecture today. One of the main impetus inspiring its curators, Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee, to repropose the discussion of the connection between history and practice quickly unfolded in the many exhibits into a series of issues, questions, and problems that sharply helped make us think again and anew about that interaction. And it helped me, and it should not surprise some of you that have known me for some time, that it did, that such a call to reconsider the relationship between the practice of design, which from now on I will call the project, and the history of architecture will be put back on the table almost immediately, would put back on the table almost immediately the concepts of type and typology. And I quote from the catalog. Typological problems are necessarily, like language, collectively derived, maintained, and extended. To study a building's typology requires the understanding that forms cross and break historical periodization. And it is not surprising either that in reproposing this topic, it resorted to both the seemingly inevitable analogy with language and to the reminder that typology works across historical periods, styles, and geographies. I would like to focus on this reappearance, but with the reminder that history does not repeat itself, and that if we hear words and thoughts that resonates with a not-so-distant past, it is an intellectual obligation to understand and flush out as quickly as possible what is different, new, and unique that distinguishes its reusage and meaning at this very moment. I would like only to sketch out this fresh situation as I see it and to stake out the intellectual territory that it occupies and in which it acts, so that we could explore these relationships of history and the project today without falling into false continuities. It helps me to start by recalling a very important moment when similarly, the world of architecture was reminded of the relevance of the concept of type in a famous article by Giulio Carlo Argan of the early 60s, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and with which I would like to begin to focus the discussion today. And you can read it as I speak. I'm not going to read all these quotes. But while similar with the Chicago Biennale because it was a reminder, a reappearance, the times are totally different in each instance. It was important in the 60s, and it's important today for many, but different reasons. For the first instance, because it was written for an exclusively scholarly audience of historians, but resonated in the field of architectural practice in a reprint by the now legendary Architectural Design magazine of Monica Pigeon at the time that for many it was feeling as the twilight days of the languishing modernism. For the second, for what it says about the genesis of a type and what it doesn't or leaves out, and which I hope would be at least sketched out the discussion of this lecture. Starting here, as this was indeed a new, provocative, new conceptual ingredient inserted in the discussion at the twilight of the dominance of modernism, architecture needed only a decade and a half to see a subsequent flurry of active architectural minds working around it, both in terms of project and theory. On the left, an Anglo-Saxon view represented by those books and publications, and on the right, a continental view, you can use that word, both reflected a renewed interest in the foundational role of architectural history in the project, the use of precedent and type, and the indisputable protagonistic role of the city in the speculation and theorization about urbanism, architecture, and their relationship to culture. But they did not share their same understanding of the nature of type, and certainly a different view of what city they were referring to. At the height of this intense period of theoretical and design production in 1978, a landmark contribution and pivotal point to this profound debate was Rafael Moneo's article in Oppositions 12 that clarified not only our understanding of typology's role in the project, but as importantly, with great lucidity and succinctness in its historicized the diverse incarnations of the concept of type and typology in the history of architectural thinking. Just as a parenthesis, I'm showing all these covers of books and magazines, which I think are actually quite appropriate for tonight celebrating a publication, but because, you know, these are images for us in my generation and probably the subsequent one that are very important and are associated with ideas, but of course now with other ways of communications are losing their allure and their significance, but it's good to remember these images of books that are associated with ideas and look at that still with love, and as I'm looking at these books tonight on the table. Let me recall the memorable, for me, opening statement of that article by Moneo, immediately followed by yet another in which he relativizes the very unity of the concept of type and typology by establishing the dialectics at play. To answer it means for each generation, and that's important, a redefinition of the essence of architecture and an explanation of all its attendant problems. This in turn requires the establishment of a theory whose first question must be, what kind of object is a work of architecture? This question ultimately has to return to the concept of type. This is a powerful conceptual capsule, which he then proceeds to develop systematically in its historical, theoretical, and operative dimensions. I take now from Moneo's argument the complex dialectics of the nature of typology. On the one hand, the implicit unifying idea that typology and type are constitutive parts of what architecture is, but also, and on the other, that as such, they are not immutable, but rather they are variables that in the process of design occupy different positions and partake on different roles, depending on the historical circumstances and opportunities, and perhaps, yes, even on the spirits of the times. At this point, I need to state perhaps the obvious, but sometimes forgotten condition of existence of this concept, that for all is the temptations to analogize it to the natural science from where it borrowed its vocabulary, architectural typology is not a scientific category, but an ideological construct, one that exists in culture like any narrative literary structure that organizes, explains, and enacts its cultural practice. As such, its theoretical outlook and position is variable. It is the accumulation of these different positionings that I want to review first tonight, starting with the semi-conscious awareness that maybe there are buildings that share formal properties, something that was certainly evident to an observer at the time of Vitruvius and became clearer later with the tangible reality of the cities of the Renaissance, when buildings could be perceived and understood as belonging to classes of buildings. To this, Serlio stepped in with a first proto-classification that created a framework around which a discourse about the still unnamed concept of type could evolve and emerge. That conceptual breakthrough needed to wait for the fertile 17th and 18th century, particularly in France, with Perrault, Logier, Quatremer de Cancy, who saw type as vehicle for ideation, up to the end of the 18th, to Boulez and Ledoux's work in the late 18th, who proposed substantial, serious theoretical content to those observable classes of buildings by coining the term that defines a new concept, character, which for them, it is that which makes buildings communicate what they are for, and thus elevate type from its mere relationship, although type is not really used systematically at this time yet. It elevates time from its mere relationship to buildings to the category of architecture with a capital A, and begin to insinuate the concept as an operational one and not just as a historical category of analysis. It is soon after when the student Jean-Nicolas Durand truly swerves the course of this conceptual evolution, transforming character into genre and moving from discourse to methodology. In this vision, the grid, the axis, and the operation of composition of elements based on a limited repertoire of forms are the interactive elements of a method that could produce any building. They are also the emblems of the typological birthmark, no more nor less, of formal architectural education of which we are all inheritors. We have then discourse first and method after installed in our consciousness as significant moments for our analysis. Here, a word perhaps is needed to register the ambiguous relationship of modernism towards type and typology. Within the diversity of incarnations of modernism, it is possible to find a consistent and recurrent idea of type directly tied to the Beaux-Arts tradition and methodologies of compositions, as many historians and theorists, Rainer Barhams notably, have pointed out, but noticing that while they all remain ambivalent, if not antagonistic, to the role that historical precedent might play in the process of design, they do so while displaying all along a constant adherence to the rationale that it was indeed very modern to classify certain formal classes of buildings and even offer them in the format of catalogs as long as they were types of modern inventions, such as one of its most defining topics, function, and of which housing typologies is its paradigm. It is this oscillating path of changing positions that makes us, or at least myself, ask on the occasion of that Chicago call to restart the discourse of typology, where are we today in our theoretical and operational relationships to them? I don't think I can get all of those answers tonight, but I can sense that we can describe the fields, take out a conceptual territory, and take a calculated position so as to then begin that task. For that, I propose an exercise of analysis that I found revelatory. Let's say, for lack of a better word, that we are going to psychoanalyze the typological mind by going to subconscious origins, observing the material and factual basis on which it is founded and how it acts that sit on the pre-discourse moment when typology did not exist as a consciousness, a method, or a conceptual apparatus, when we only had the facts of buildings. This is important because if acting as historians do, and for good reasons, we rely on historical evidence based on written material on discourse, then the Renaissance is our only possible starting point for understanding typology. What I'm proposing, in short, is to complete the scope of our understanding by attempting to describe the full arch of typology's presence as it accompanies architecture from its very beginnings in the act of making at the times when, while architecture is indisputable present in the life of men, the intellectual awareness of any typological structure, theorization, and further methodological propositions was not. We will then perhaps get a glimpse at the infancy, if we can say that, use that metaphor, of the typological mind at this moment of innocence. In short, let's try a sort of anthropology of the concept of typology. After that, we can complete such arch by considering the question as to where we are today. For tonight, and as a first step, let's just move only a little further back in time from the Renaissance and place ourselves in the high Middle Ages at a remarkable place, Sicily. Why Sicily? To make a very long story short but very clear, it is sufficient to say that Sicily is a very important and formative part of my life as an architect, and that's it. One that provided me with rich resources to get to what I wanted to explore tonight, and distant enough from the canonical cultural centers of Europe. First, an event an anecdote, an event in 1988. I was invited to participate in an international symposium in Palermo to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the consecration of the cathedral. It was organized as a gathering of scholars and practitioners with the aim to obtain informed and consensual strategies about how to approach the restoration and conservation on this unique and complex monument. The cathedral today shows in its architectural magnificence the record of wealth of the different civilizing moments of its history, with chiefly major modifying interventions during the Renaissance, during the Baroque and the Neoclassical periods, as well as displaying the visible vestiges of all its earlier Norman foundational stages in the 12th century. To my surprise, over 3 days of deliberations by scholars in the fields of history, history of art, history of architecture, archaeology, paleography, and architectural conservation, yielded no insights or serious advice to help the imminent decisions to proceed with conservation and restoration measures of the monument. What it did produce, though, was a partisan war between factions defending a certain historical or stylistic period and promoting selective erasures of some in favor of others, and all of this in the name of authenticity. I surprised myself with my response on a forum where I had arrived humbly as an outsider hoping to learn from learned colleagues about respect and care for the monument. I discarded my prepared speech in favor of an improvised rejoinder based on the very important aesthetic as well as intellectual experience I've had with this building that I saw as part of a larger, extensive experience of the unique architecture of this island. After 8 years of continued work and having traveled constantly from one end to the other in the confines of Sicily, I had always delighted at one particular felicitous history coincidence in the region of Palermo. In parallel to its cathedral, there are 2 other ones that were erected concurrently in the last decades of the 12th century, all promoted by the same patron, the Norman court, and driven by an equal goal. Each one had the aspiration to become the mother cathedral of the recently established Norman Kingdom of Sicily. Needless to say, in the context of our conversation, the 3 shared identical architectural typological origins. Starting with the earliest, Cefalù, that you see magnificent in that town emerging, and followed by, and this is still Cefalù, followed by Monreale, almost concurrently with the Cathedral of Palermo. These 3 competing magnificent monumental works provide a perfect laboratory for a comparative exploration of how a preconscious typological mind would imagine and create buildings, deal with programmatic requirements, specific site, social, political, material conditions, and, this is important, over time evolve along their own individual trajectories to produce highly singular, different buildings. Let me cut through details and summarize my reaction at the Cathedral of Palermo Symposium by saying that what prompted such reaction was my awareness of those startling differences among them, singularities that these 3 buildings present precisely as the tangible, historical, and artistic lesson that they propose, one next to the other and capable of being experienced in a single day's journey. There you have them in geography and their distances, about the multiple possibilities that identical initial defining formal starting point offered for their diverging itineraries, which makes each one of them become a unique and extraordinary piece of architecture. Cefalù is where we can test and experience the original idea intact and the pains of its typological struggles. Monreale, where we assist to an unmatched spatial mutation, we'll see more slides later, that alter the building's experience as it becomes a literal canvas for the propagation of the faith in their unfolding over the interior walls of an iconographic program that leaves no square inch uncovered and transforms its space. Palermo instead registered the animated, intense, and at times violent architectural history of this particular society, its ideology, its politics, its struggles over 7 centuries. Thus, for me, at the symposium, to favor one period over another as authentic was denying Palermo precisely its authenticity of having been protagonist of a very different history than their 2 other near siblings. Here we see the original descriptions of the 3 in their respective dates of consecration. These look, typologically speaking, pretty much the same at first, but on closer look, they begin to show some dissimilarities. Cefalù, the one chronologically more distant by a few decades from the others two, reflects clearly a divergent format of what would become normative of what is known the Sicilian Norman architecture. In the subsequent 2, Monreale and Palermo, the marked difference in plan, the addition of an extra component in the sanctuary is supported by the political mutations of Sicily in that period, the functional ritualistic requirements in the late 12th century when the former Norman dukedom becomes the Norman kingdom of Sicily, and then to accommodate in the cathedral both royal thrones, king and queen, and the burial sites of the kings, family, and those of the archbishops required more space. Oops. I should go here. Ooh, I'm getting, okay. So we were there, no? Yeah. Hence, the doubling up of what appears to be the crossing, or in their liturgical language, the addition of the unusual antititulus to the titulus, whose absence in Cefalù on the left eliminated it automatically as a contender. It just came too early in the history. Such an expansion is easy to understand for functional reasons, but it is also an already red flag. What are the titulus and antititulus? We need just a parenthesis for a bit of straight history here. The adventurous Normans conquered Sicily in 1060 after a sweeping spread through the confines of the continent with final stops in 2 of their major islands, Britain and Sicily. But while upon their arrival in Britain, they found and conquered a marginal Anglo-Saxon European Christian domain, in Sicily itself, the central point of the Mediterranean, they confronted a centuries-old complex and well-organized society that was shaped by the accumulated sediment of the cultures that had inhabited this land at the crossroads of the Mediterranean: Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Arabs. Indeed, when the Normans arrived, what they found and conquered was a society where the prevalent political, social, cultural makeup was that of a fresh, cultivated, and inspiring Islamic society that had spread from the Middle East of Spain to Northern Africa. From the Middle East to Spain through Northern Africa. To make things more complex, this well-organized and evolved society ruled by the Islamic Fatimid dynasty was a politically and administratively tolerant society that allowed Christianity to exist and even flourish. But, and this is the important thing for us, it was not the Christianity that the Normans brought in, that is the Roman Latin Christianity, but the Oriental, Greco-Byzantine rule, and this displacement presented for the conquering Normans a double adversary to be dominated both politically and ideologically, as the Eastern Christian Church was already a rebel to the Roman papacy, and on the initial days of their definitive schism in 1054, at the same time that the Normans needed to keep their allegiance to Rome. This complex and tense cultural and ideological panorama as a context together will be a continuous, clear political strategy of the Normans to be flexible and accommodating to circumstances and locality, begin to give us an important clue to understanding these and other transformative cycles of established architectural precedent. We now look really close to these plans and begin to notice very strange things. It was not, as we thought first, a basilican Latin plan after all, although it did desperately want it to be one. What we have here is an unprecedented, in fact, unimaginably conflation of plans of both rivals' cities. Part a Latin basilica, we see there, Old St. Peter as the model, and part a Byzantine centralized cross plan on the right. Combined as a recognition that while coming with the blessing of the Roman Pope, the reality in the field obliged the Normans to address and include the Byzantine rites in the local Christian flock. The consequences are enormous, and they are new and for a while uncertain and unresolved relationships between nave and sanctuary. Just to notice the most evident and never resolved, the contradiction between the desired Latin transept and the centralized crossing, so clearly visible still today in Cefalù. And here you see the section of the supposed crossing, which, as you can see, is far from resolved. There is no crossing. And only smoothed out, though not really resolved either, in this minor church a few decades later in Palermo to prove that the works continues to try to resolve these. And there is more. The campanile, which was a somewhat free-flowing element in Western Europe, sometimes extant, sometimes on one side, others at the center or in the back, but a prevalent feature of Romanesque architecture, here is perfunctorily located in Cefalù and Monreale as a robust, disproportionately broad flanking pair in the facade, disguising what in reality they were in this political context, military defensive structures. A defensive motivation that becomes very explicit in the most striking move of the later one, the Cathedral of Palermo, where, and I'm not showing chronologically by piece rather here, in the Cathedral of Palermo, when the defensive tower emerges as a distinctive compositional element on its own right and without precedent in the whole history of church building. It is a massive single tower located precisely on axis with the nave of the church in front of the facade, which it shares its width and symmetry axis, but from a military standpoint, amplifying the visual reach and defensive efficiency of the cathedral that doubles up now as a fortress with an unusual and very efficient continuous circulation loop that requires the construction of two supportive arches in the main facade to bridge the street and complete the circuit. You see there the red dots are those passages that will cross the street to the tower, to the campanile, let's call it. Now, staying and focusing on this tower as purely formal elements help us change yet again our direction of inquiry to reveal another dimension of this story of intense formal cross-fertilization and transformations. These massive prismatic volumes are part of a material, technological, as well as formal vocabulary that populated the island by the 12th century. They are the Arab defensive towers that are spread by the hundreds throughout the island still. Indeed, the Normal dynasty of the Hautevilles did not come to Sicily carrying in their Viking via Normandy luggage a complete kit of architectural, artistic, technical, and ideological ready-mades. They brought memories of buildings, of experiences, and practical knowledge that they were forced to adapt, complement, and change under local conditions. And the local conditions were those of a well-organized and advanced society with its own architecture and engineering and skilled labor, well above the practical knowledge that these Nordic adventurers could deploy. And there was a local Arab aesthetic so peculiarly consistent and widespread throughout Sicily during their almost 4 centuries of Arab dominance, a type of masonry construction and precision labor that produced this massive, prismatic, and crisp, chiseled, detailed, and carved in architecture with filigreed geometric decoration and elaborate structural motifs that continues to appear long after the Normans are settled and in control, particularly when we moved from religious architecture into noble domestic architecture, where freedom from tradition, these are the palace of the Norman kings, what I'm going to show now. It seems unbelievable that these, where freedom from traditions, rituals, and symbols are more possible. It seems unbelievable that these are the palaces of Norman kings and nobles, only a few generations separated from their origins in northern France and early roots in Scandinavia. Finally, a decisive touch we found in the interiors of this so-called Norman Arab architecture, which is neither another yet different artistic practice, rooted in another cultural, okay, there were more of these, this is what I'm referring to. Another artistic practice rooted in another cultural and technological source that finally gives this architecture its complex identity. And this is now Monreale and the transformation of that type just by the way in which the mosaic develops illustrations, and decoration. Attesting yet to another prior civilization that just remained after their political demise in the hands and eyes of their building trades. We are at a point we can take some stock out of all of these. What we see in this intense and short-lived episode of architectural experimentation, short because it's 150 years, no more, is the productive dynamics of an unchecked typological force in action, what I labeled early a preconscious moment when typology is just an operative force made by the accumulated experience and memories of a culture and propelled by the particular demands of place and time that need to be articulated into forms, all without the pause and consideration required by theory and conceptual frameworks. I would like these preconscious moments as defined or inhabited by techne. All of this is a work in progress, this diagram here, so I'll appreciate if you want to challenge some of these words, but I think they give a sense of what I'm trying to say. It is remarkable to see the ease with which opposite ideas and symbols and the forces of functions, ideology, politics, technology, and craftsmanship harmonize and express in each case a strong sense of determination to move ahead and to create, yes, new architecture. Because what is ultimately even more impressive is the resulting feast of creativity, inventiveness, and formal as well as ideological freedom all this has on the occasions when it needs to work out problems. How the confrontation of rival, adversary, contradictory, or presumable irreconcilable and antithetical ideas and elements mix, blend, copulate, and create the new, the ineffable, the pleasurable. It confirms the loose connection that formal play has with typological rigor, but at the same time its dependence on the permanence of some formal cues and relationships that assure intelligibility, continuity, communication. Just a sample of some of the contemporary buildings that appear around Palermo attest to this. And I'm just going to have you enjoy about 10 slides of some of these buildings around Palermo. That's San Giovanni degli Eremiti. That's La Mangione, sort of a masterpiece of stone construction and geometry. And we saw that. That's the side view on the back. And of course, for me, the jewel, San Cataldo, one of the tiniest churches ever, that has this kind of gracious work in stone and this amazing interior. I want to take note without further elaboration and for everyone to think and ponder that typology, in whatever degree of consciousness it acts in the minds and hands of the designer, certainly demonstrates in these architectural examples the power it possesses and the central role it assumes in the articulation of the complex variables and issues related to the expression of cultural identity and to the integration of cultural diversity at both levels of the production of architecture. On the one hand, at the conception of new works, and on the other, at the formulation of strategies for the conservation of old ones. Themes that I need not to stress much to this audience are pressing and inescapable today in the practice of architecture, a practice of cultural significance per excellence. And that will be a topic that I would hope I will develop further in the very near future. But let's continue. There's one more very important attribute of type. in the way we have come to understand these relationships to visuality and the imagination that I would like to extract from these examples. If we look again at the Cathedral of Palermo now, in reverse historical sequence, understanding that what we are seeing today is the result of a series of continuous changes, not only in ornamentation and decor, but also on the overall spatial configuration and image of the building, starting with the radical expert transformation in the hands of Florentine neoclassical architect Ferdinando Fuga on the right, the last big transformation at the end of the 18th century, which finally manages, to transform the still odd Norman, Arab, Byzantine hybrid into a veritable Roman Catholic Latin cross basilical artifact with its dome and its unifying interior organization. Not a change easy to swallow for us, I have to say, regardless of the intrinsic and skillful merits of Fuga's designs. Let's work in reverse, just looking at the image, to the original final product at the end of the 12th century. What you're going to see is the Photoshop of the middle picture that it was done in the 17th century, showing the presence before the latest changes by Fuga. So we'll see the Fuga first, then that original painting, and then based on all the scholarship that we have at hand and documents, the original cathedral, and I think it's quite revealing, and I don't need to say anything. This is pretty much the cathedral we see today. This is the cathedral before that intervention, neoclassical intervention. And this is the original Palermo in 1185. From all the documents and the archaeological and the building evidence, this is exactly what was planned. No towers, just a cathedral and a fort. I focus on that because while today this might seem obvious, it was not. Okay, I'm sorry. What is stunning, I was just going to ahead, that is the ease with which the image of the building disassociates itself from the typology that is corresponding immutable plan type produced, underlines the non-necessity of a strict or even logical, let alone necessary, relationship between an abstract or generic notion of type and that of its image. And it was on this, let's call it mutual indifference between type and image, that much of the initial energy of postmodernism rested on and played with. I focus on that because while today this might seem obvious, it was not the most prevalent notion both in the history and the practice of architecture of how type operated until that moment in the late 20th century, and it brings our discussion somewhat suddenly and abruptly to the other end of the chronological arch and to our own days. So in the context of this lecture, let me summarize what I think are the most important contributions that, from the start, postmodernism made to the advancement of architecture and architectural discourse. The reactivation and articulation in practice of the concept of type, and the possibility, or more accurately, the promise of a methodology of design based on it. In this is one of the most important, profound, and lasting effects of postmodernism. It also brought up, in its revival of type and typology, two very important and, for me, new elements. A consciousness of and a focus, explicit or implicit, on the possibilities of transformative operations on type. The recognition that a type could be understood as a malleable, pliable, deformable matter, aesthetically, materially, dimensionally, rhetorically. And second, that it understood that there was an active and complex relationship between type and image, that type may contain an image, that it could change it or exchange it for another, that ultimately type could be an image. We can take a deep breath and now look at the two exemplar protagonists, and these are their portraits, you know them, of that moment of awareness, Robert Venturi and Aldo Rossi, who relied on the possibility and need to disconnect an abstract, generic form from a concrete image for the explorations of their concerns in the project, although in opposite ways. It is very revelatory that the very first image in Learning from Las Vegas is this one, and I have to give you a warning. This is really the first page in the first edition. It was never done again, and I cannot understand why. But after I presented this, some people had looked for this and couldn't find it, and we realized that it only appears in the first edition, the very first one of 72, from La Loudon Encyclopedia, which could be seen in closer looks for its novelty in the architectural discourse. So it presents a house for a man and his wife without children. Those are the labels. With veranda and terrace, it's always the same house. With trellis, or is not, with castellated Gothic jacket, with monastic Gothic jacket, and with Elizabethan jacket. It is also notable and fascinating to dwell a bit on how many similarities exist between Venturi and Rossi's thinking that underline the complexity of their relationships with architecture and type. I'm going to go fast on this because I know you all know that very well. When looking for sources of their thought and inspiration for their architecture, Venturi and Rossi have a great predilection for the vernacular, popular, or minor architecture of anonymity. They both rely on the visual arts as sources for their architecture, particularly modern or contemporary art, and they say so. Of course, Venturi, all the relations for Oldenburg, Warhol, and all the implications that this type of art has for architecture and its particular architecture. The images of Cironi and of the Chirico that are so important in the understanding of Rossi's imagination. And they both have also clear empathy with the objects of everyday life. Here we see the Sweet Powell set by Venturi of teapots and that, and then the famous coffee maker by Alessi, by Rossi. And both Venturi and Aldo Rossi relied on the possibility and need for theoretical reasons to disconnect an abstract generic form of type from a concrete image for the explorations of their concerns in the project, although in opposite ways. In Venturi's case, the complex relationship between typology, history, and images was inherent in the way he understood and conceived architecture. He sought solid sustenance in the history of Western art and architecture as source of precedent and knowledge, but having detected early on the possibility of a separation of image from type, and it's interesting that he, in one of his examples, relies on the Church of La Martorana of Palermo and the surface of mosaics that in a way do not respond necessarily clearly to the tectonics of the building that have a kind of independence. He offers not just an explanation as to how image works, at least in the American urban landscape, but also proposes a methodology of work that would permit and give validity to the image-free place in the project. What is the decorated shed, a concept worked together with Dennis Scott Brown, but a powerful demonstration of that principle in which they follow religiously in all their work. But also where is the support of such claim? If we look into history, we find clearly that in some of the examples of the Baroque, which were so impressed the mind of Venturi, at least you know all these examples, I don't need to go in detail. Rossi, on the other end of the spectrum, struggled with a counterforce. While declaring early on that type is indifferent to function, he's silent about such possibility between type and image. It is because for his purposes, he needs a stable image. He's into deep search for an ultimate and inexpugnable principle that would anchor the elusive type into the larger and more solid matrix of the city. And in proving his thesis, he succumbs inexorably to image. And architecture, as architecture always does when it wants to persuade, but it is not yet present in the world. It needs a drawing, a model, a miniature that could synthesize and convey the principle. Indeed, Rossi, in his attempt to represent and condense the abstract, complex, and expansive conceptual model that puts in motion the dynamics of the trio architectural typology, urban morphology, and collective memory, demanded the impossible: to find a synthetic visual illustration that could embody such complexity. And that image, which needs to be expressed in a drawing, cannot be specific but abstract, which is, of course, an impossibility. But even if the task is impossible, it is complicated by his own reductive and personal views as to what are the constitutive elements of his complex vision. His own words in this beautiful, melancholic paragraph, full of images, are nevertheless the equivalent of the closing of the door to the possibilities of typology in action. Peter Eisenman's caustic but incisive characterization of Rossi's buildings as, and I quote, poor representations of his drawings, put the finger in the wound, showing the potential of Rossi's extraordinary propositions being capable of causing their own undoing and demise. In fact, there is something purely circumstantial about the way in which the tremendous impact of Rossi's ideas led to their instantaneous mass consumption as a result of a dissemination that was affected mostly by means of the powerful images of his drawings, a process that my generation witnessed with awe, that was fast and widespread and would reduce all the richness of his thinking to the power of a few condensed images, which in turn ended up by being synthesized in a single one, the lonely cabin. For all its profound intellectual intensities, Rossi's typology enshrined in mesmerizing drawings and less convincing buildings, with all their simplicity, impacting communicability, and resonating references to primeval elementary architectures, the primitive hat of all became reduced in its dissemination to the innocent cabin, and as such, to the universal icon. Both the reductionist precipice opened by Rossi's type and the open-ended ability of Venturi's type to play free with images, both undertakings intellectually profound and visually provocative, undermine the very efficacy of typology, which is based on its capacity to harmonize principle and expression with motivation, abstract formal clarity with inspired visual articulation in order to express an idea or a concept as both work at the streams of the possibility of the project. One, obsessively offering type as a transcendental, quasi-tragic icon, the other as an elusive, dizzying carousel of fantasies. In this panorama of how type inhabits the practice of architecture in its prehistory, we can now represent the saga of typology in its highest period of postmodernism as associated with the evolution from conscious to self-conscious and defined by the activity of criticism. And further, I would like to complete this working model with what defines the way typology is operating uninterruptedly since then, decisively and almost exclusively in the realm of image itself. In view of this, and for the first 2 decades, many had predicted the death of type and typology in any of its modalities, and for a while, the flurry of enthralling, smooth, atypological images that the contemporary impact of digital technology and computation ceaselessly produced seemed to prove that type would never recover its hold. Rightly, it was easy to see that the degradation produced by postmodernism was attributable to the effects of too much image and little substance as the conditions were for typology to survive, and that all that was possible to expect from it was a final fall into historical pastiche. But not so fast. After Rossi and Venturi, could be said that type, reduced to an icon, became instead a persistent and indestructible representation of a kind of typology in waiting itself. The cabin's image, or the undifferentiating housing block, in different renditions became the refuge of an idea of architecture in an impasse that is showing signs of ending. For now, too long a time, a condition of no method, no discourse, no self-analysis, plus the exhaustion of theory prevail, and indeed this state of mind did produce a stalemate where type waits as an actor on the sides for the right moment to enter the scene and recover protagonism. In fact, and startlingly, if we look closely, we can trace it in the work of some of the most important representative architects of this postmodern period, beginning with an unsuspected fellow, Frank Gehry, who in my view is a very consistent typologist. Observing deeply and carefully through his oeuvre, in between the folds of the formal bravura, there is a clear constant dialogue of his formal experimentation with type at its most basic, almost Rossian version, and a conscious engagement from the outset to the final product with a typological presence in the recurrence of the image of type in almost all his projects. Just some examples from all different periods of his work. The early house for a filmmaker that dismantles the conventional suburban house but deploys all of the Durandian, if you allow me this neologism, elements, living room, patio, corridor, as if waiting for a renewed method of composition. This cutting up of the domestic typological elements frozen at the expectant moment of waiting for the editors to splice it into a new whole defines well that Gehry's moment as a preamble to the following stages of his production. Loyola were competing icons of types, the chapel, the temple, the urban housing bar, are deployed in a fragmentary arrangement and where from its most Rossian element, the long rectilinear bar, dotted with equal rectangular basic windows, burst out the uncontrolled rolling stair. A move of contrasting formal opposites makes its appearance and will become, in more and more fluid Baroque versions, his later signature. It seems that Gehry always needs to have the immutable city of Rossi in the vicinity to put his signature on it. Prague is the proof, where the whole architectural idea depends on a borrowed Baroque metaphor of movement to effect a contextual approach to the historical city by deforming the monotonous dominant infill housing typology. And Bilbao, when even under the most extreme formal exuberance, there remains silent but persistent the Russian urban types that would connect it to the 19th century city. Finally, Berlin, in my view, his most distilled and elegant rendition of these ideas, where the enforcement of urban design rules in the historic center imposes on the project the calm discipline and order of the European city, and where the Gehry effect is that reserved for the interior, where we find the jewel as being offered in an exquisite wooden coffer. We can check Koolhaas on this too. Not a denier of typology himself, his love affair with the skyscraper, his defining favorite type, he seemed for a while unsettled with it in his many trials that oscillate between, on the one hand, his breathtaking CCTV in Beijing, a daring annihilation of the formal function and symbolic characteristics of the skyscraper, now reduced, defeated to an earth scraper, and on the other hand, with a notable immediate retraction soon after in a quasi-penitent act of mea culpa with the irrefutably typological triumphant set in the Rotterdam. Perhaps today the most poignant and persistent example of this typological presence can be found in the work of Herzog and de Meuron, with their insistence on a single image that recurs ritualistically at regular intervals, as in a litany of typological reaffirmation, as if to say that in their hearts the Rosen cabin will always be present, and that it needs to be sacrificed periodically as an act of purification, which is also to acknowledge in these periodic homages, as they do openly, their debt to their teacher and mentor. This act of seemingly eternally recurrent reincarnation, which sometimes has the feeling of a requiem, seems to have reached a moment of mutation that I observe with great interest, as it seemed to announce a reversal of this religious tone when the emblematic cabin, imaginatively altered, becomes the generation of one of their, Herzog and de Meuron's, most extraordinary, vigorous, and complex urban interventions where everything is the same, but also all is change. The Feltrinelli Foundation in Milano, where the gable section becomes urban morphology, building typology, memory, which paradoxically, even the historical references produces a tremendous novelty in this vibrant European modern city. The type has even become indifferent to a corresponding urban morphology, as this gable section has nothing to do with the city of Milan, with this particular neighborhood, nor with the buildings, fortification walls, and city gates that used to occupy the site. Change in scale, it is now a gigantic cabin recast in glass and reincarnated as a horizontal skyscraper that reinvigorates and probably shows an aperture to a new direction of a free image in search of a type. Multiple displacements and inversions, conceptual, formal, scalar, material, figurative, that both confuse origins but proceed with typological clarity to reconfigure the city. A lot to be expected from this, at least from me. In closing now, where do I find my thinking about architecture and typology at this moment? I think first, Moneo is still right, and we will have to answer the challenge he posed now to us, to each generation, as he said. Second, that this impasse has given us, what has given us is the time to understand better not only what was going on in parallel in architecture, and sustain with composure and patience the end of the exhausting parade of somewhat sterile by necessary formal experimentation that the arrival of digital technologies of representation produced as the tests needed to run their course. Moreover, we have calmly absorbed the realization that architecture is standing in a new playing ground, and that is playing with old and also new protagonists, conditions, and rules and technologies that need a welcome consideration. But I'm also suggesting that indeed we should consider likely that the questions we ask ourselves today may require, as I believe always had, that we return to the concept of type. It seems that we cannot evict it from the creative process, and that indeed type inhabits the project as a permanent tenant. It should also be welcomed back. Under what guise it will show up, it is unclear. We notice that it shows in very different guises and with different states of mind. Throughout its history, we've seen it at times appears as experience, as idea, at others as a method, as a discourse, as an image, and as an icon. Should we not consider the possibility that image might be by now totally independent of iconographic associations and perhaps be considered as free form itself, within which it still may resonate its original typological pedigree, and play with it intelligently, judiciously, and architecturally, as Jacques and Pierre seem to be doing here? As I intimated earlier, we have also been awakened to the new demands of both modes of conservation, environmental and cultural, with their associated polemics and cultural wars. To the marvels of this digital technology, computation, and associated cultural dominance of the world of images, and in short, to all the technological advances in material structure, social formations, and the crisis of politics and institutions. Such panoply of riches that we are offered should also propel us to try to conceive new possibilities of types. So while accepting Rafael Moneo's challenge, I'm tempted to take exception to Argand's narrower view of his understanding of the genesis of type as only a result of a synthesis of past occurrences. I truly believe that when we move from the field of scholarship into the world of design and into the project, a type can indeed be invented, but not out of nothing, as some designers have hoped in the recent past, as they wash their hands and relinquish their responsibility for making decisions about form to the control of algorithms, but out of architecture itself. That means a close, intelligent relationship between history and design. Sorry, we cannot dream of returning to our infancy, even if we may yearn for the mythical times when the builder could play freely with types, words, forms, and still be surprised by them. But I hope I have helped us to see how still the powerful combination of history and the project can propel the imagination to yet unimagined results. Thank you. That's my favorite building, by the way. That's
there any?
Thank you for reminding us that while we can't return to our childhood, we can thank you for reminding us that while we can't return to our childhood, we can at least return to Palermo.
It's a winning proposition.
Yeah. You mentioned type and typology throughout the lecture, sometimes in tandem, sometimes interchangeably, perhaps. And near the very end, you suggested that perhaps type was a subset of typology. I can't remember the exact quote, but I'm wondering if you see a difference between the two, and if so.
I mean, the difference is that they refer to different categories of things. Type refers to the element, typology, perhaps to a system, I mean, in which they are organized or understood, which of course is variable over time.
Right.
But I think they are part of the same type of discourse. Yeah. I mean, one is an element, and the other is a system that organizes according to some criteria, I would say.
Great.
I mean, as it was in the natural sciences and all that. That's where it comes from. Yeah.
Thank you.
That microphone is...
Do you need? Okay, you can go ahead and project.
Hola.
I remember in 1971, there was an essay that we read in virtually every class at Princeton, which was by Alan Calhoun called Typology
Yes.
Design Method.
Yes.
And there was something...
It was in one of my first slides, just the cover of that, because that was the Anglo-Saxon view. It's one of the best examples. Yeah.
Well, it was an interesting essay because it was considered sufficiently dangerous, the idea of typology,
Yeah.
that he was very tentative about it.
Yeah.
You may remember. And then it grew from that seed. And then there were quite a few of us who thought that typology would provide the reconciliation out of the crisis of style.
Yeah.
It would provide an urbanism. And I remember being quite shocked in the 90s in the academy when typology was categorically rejected.
Yeah.
Even typology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now there seems to be for you a kind of
No, I think through the facts of what's going on. That's what I'm trying to.
That's what you're saying. Could you tell us the more recent history of that emergence and then the dismissal? Talk about the dismissal.
Well, I think there is this big parenthesis in the more sort of in the curricula and in the thinking and in the theory and in the so-called discourse of this that has. I mean, in a way, that's what I'm referring to, that there is this impasse in which accepting the fact that architecture has to, at some point, be confronted, as Moneo says, with type and typology. But I do think the effect, honestly, of the new technologies of representation had such an impact and had such a mesmerizing effect on architects as these things that appear to produce form, you know, without our intervention. That I think, and the possibility of creating these very alluring things that we just had for a couple of decades, that I think now that has run its course in a good way, in the sense that now we know what it can be done. It's a technology. And as you begin to think about, again, what is at the bottom and behind and around that, which is architecture, how we conceive and do that, then, and how you incorporate that as a technology to produce that, that's what we have to, in a way, put ourselves in a different position to, because it cannot be the same as Rossi and Venturi, obviously. I think we live it.
Do you find resistance to your planting the flag again, to your making?
No, I think it's amazing the response to this type of hypotheses and interpretations today from the students. It's quite amazing. I mean, it's in some of the things are ahead. I mean, they are already operating in that way. I think, of course, there are some architects showing also that kind of intensity in Europe, mostly, I would say, but some around here too, yeah. No, I'm pretty confident that this is back, seriously. Yep.
Don't you think the challenge came before the digital, and it came with the idea of the diagram, which is philosophically and epistemologically an alternative, something very different to the type. Right.
The diagram had, for me, at least, a very ephemeral impact. It just came and went. I don't think it was that.
No, I think it came and stayed, actually, because it's not that it's a fad, but it's really a different way to think about the world and architecture. Right. Right, but there was I remember that the first challenge to the type came from the discussions around the diagram as the.
Well, I don't know. It might be for me, the first came from a kind of, let's say it was probably in the 90s. Do you remember, it started in that short fad of what's it called, the form vague, the vague.
Terrain vague or no?
What was it? Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. Yes.
Formlessness or right.
Began to tend to formlessness.
Right.
And I think that was a reaction, very unclear. And it found in some concepts that were, intelligent concepts.
Right.
Kind of that was very short. Maybe you're right. It didn't affect me in the sense that way, the diagram, because I saw it as a kind of old, a kind of rehash of an old notion of how do you start a project, which is with a diagram, you know. I was taught in a way that way in Argentina. But maybe it meant different. I never paid too much attention. That's all.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, in the writings of Rossi, the monument is as important as a category as the time.
Yeah.
And yet, when translated in particular to the Anglo-Saxon world, architectural world, the monument is somehow forgotten. And time is where most of the discussion has taken place in regards to Rossi's thought. Isn't that an approach that diminishes, in a way, the complexity of his thought?
No, of course, the way that I have much more to say, that's not the purpose tonight. I mean, the way Rossi's work was disseminated in America is actually a phenomenon in itself. All almost literally overnight. And it's only through image. There was nothing translated of his writing. So in America, it's pure image. And it was consumed, but you know, as fast as you can imagine. And when was the architecture of the city translated in English? So many years after that it appeared. I mean, we're talking about the writings of the 60s, and I think it appears in the 80s, the translation, or the 90s, I don't know. It was very, very late. And there were only, a couple of articles. I remember one in Oppositions by Moneo, who almost introduced him to America in the late 70s, after the one, I think, in typology. But Rossi was never understood in America, which led Bob Stern to call the Rossian projects in America Rancho Rossi. Not without reason, because they were really kind of very, 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 very poor, uninformed version, and just an image, simplification. Yeah. I think Rossi is being reread today by young people with great, great interest, and they see different things that we saw, and that's curious. I'm actually running a seminar now, and that's one of the topics. So they are doing that very well.
Okay. Any other? Since there are no questions, I want to continue with this. By the way, I think the word you're looking for is the informe. Informe, right? The informe. This came from Bataille, and they adopted it in formlessness. No, but I really think it started when, for instance, with Toyo Ito, Koolhaas, Sejima. Basically, when you think about the Jussieu, the library, the ramp, that's not really a type. It's not formless. It is something else. That's the diagram. It has a certain clarity.
But then it becomes an issue of nomenclature of words, because what I'm very interested in, and it comes in the last meeting with some kind of fear. I mean, I don't want to risk too much, perhaps. What I'm interested in the idea that how types are created, because types somehow emerge at some point. And they emerge, and I try to show that by going to this problem, you know, that is political, religious, and architectural, and in Palermo, I mean, in Sicily, that they have to come up with a new type.
Right.
And I'm saying that's what I'm interested in, because I think that's what is the history of architecture. Yeah.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, you cannot deny the relationship to precedent, I mean, of course, I believe that forms can only come from forms. So, I mean, no matter how many words you put. So it's this process of transformation which I'm very interested in, and the creation of types, which I think Koolhaas in some of these projects, one can consider that.
Yes, they have what would maybe be called a typological clarity, because, I mean, the way they're organized, but in those cases, the diagram was developed so closely to a very particular situation and a particular performance, and this is how it deviates from the idea of the type, because it captures a very specific idea about how the building is going to be used. Like that, let's say the Seattle Public Library.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yes.
But precisely, I mean, maybe I'm not including this in the discussion because I consider that to be an occurrence and not necessarily a discourse of type that aspires to be more generic.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe perhaps more reductivist.
Well, no, I mean, I'm looking at I'm just, frankly, I knew the project, but when I visited the Feltrinelli Foundation just a year ago, I mean, it's quite amazing, that building. And it is at the same time typological. I mean, one can imagine, because it's generic, I mean, it's just really rental space. And it's just so full of resonances, so both architecture and history and typology, and this is entirely new and almost unprecedented, you know. So it's something.
I mean, would you suggest, Jorge, because in thinking about the comparison between the diagram, let's say, and the type, at least for me, the diagram seems more reductivist, where in your presentation, when you talk about image, you talk about culture, which today is even more complex than the situation that you describe in Palermo, because we have cultures that cross on a daily basis. And then the knowledge of history, which now is even, perhaps even more readily at our fingertips. So are you maybe suggesting that it's about more and more complexity, in fact, that allows then for distillation in the creation of new types? Which is maybe very different than the case of the diagram?
You know,
like in moving forward, forward in the
Yeah,
development of this idea.
I'm not of this. I mean, I recognize that every moment in which we find ourselves, we think it is the most complex moment, and I'm not sure it is. You know, I thought probably it was a mess for these Normans arriving in Sicily. I mean, what the hell are we going to do with all of these? So, and so it's not about the more or less complex. I think it's always complex. So it's not about that. To me now, we are not thinking about method. We are not thinking about discourse. We are so self-conscious about all of these things. And we have seen this play and this kind of uneasy and yet very dynamic relationship between image, icon, and type. That is our very recent past. And I'm saying we live in a different world. I see we are trying to generate new types for this new society and the way the city is evolving. I mean, after all, you know, the shopping mall is a new type in a certain way, you know, and it was somehow, you know, in a very pragmatic way evolved in some developers' desks, you know, by certain simplifications and syntheses and uses of precedents of how shops work and how we can reorganize them with cards. Yeah.
Every developer's building is a type or it doesn't get funded.
Yeah, exactly.
So
they have to prove that it works. Yeah.
And it's very precisely defined.
Yeah.
And the code now actually enables those types and not others.
Yeah. But, you know, we have a breakdown of institutions. I mean, architecture and the relation of architecture as institutions is not the same as in the Enlightenment, obviously. I mean, architecture is not their vehicle necessarily. I mean, they need buildings, but it's not necessarily architecture the only one. But we are all talking in our studios and, you know, looking at new forms of, you know, residential buildings for new ways of living, new types of families, by how people like to live today and in the future, things like that, that are all experimental at this moment, and you know, and there are different kinds of institutional, or I wouldn't say institutional, of other sort of organizations and that are emerging that seem to be requiring the use of certain spaces and certain configurations and probably iconography, I don't know. When you think about that moment, 312, when Constantine decides to accept and recognize Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, there are no churches yet ever built, okay? Because they are all taking place in houses. And immediately they build a church, and where do they go? They transform immediately, I mean, in such short time, the basilica type by some very radical modifications, changing, you know, some configuration, but leaving the spatial organization of a certain way, but changing the direction, creating an axis of symmetry where there was none, and an entrance where it was not, and instilling it, you know, and they used the same name, the basilica, and they invented a type. I mean, when you look at the Basilica of Trajan and St. Peter's, they're very different buildings, and they work very differently, and they mean very differently. So, and it just is that those moments that I'm very interested in.
an emergent? I mean, is it invented by the architect, or is it a process that is autonomous and that develops over time and that eventually?
Yeah, well, I think it's a process. I don't think you invent and you say, this is typology, and you publish a book and it will become. So I think it just is a result of the forces that are working on design at a given time, and how architecture moves in a certain direction, and there are convergences, and finally it's an emergence, obviously, yeah. I think we're trying to detect now, that's what I was just pointing out at this kind of cameo appearances in these projects of these architects that presumably did something else. We are trying to detect how it's going to reappear, because one thing Moneo doesn't say, but it's implied, is that each generation has to confront the problem of typology, but also has to define again what it is, because it's always been different, okay? And that's also the other problem we need to sort out and keep on probably talking and analyzing what's being done.
So should the methodology of typological design be done backwards? I mean, instead of analyzing Palermo, the Cattedrale di Palermo, from 1312 to 1876,
Yeah.
analyze it backwards from 1876 all the way to 1312.
Well, but that's an analytical tool I use because I think it's very convincing about that particular fact I was trying to show, the independence, the indifference or independence between image and type, you know. But it's not a method, I would say. You know, I'm very scared, probably more than anything else, about method, you know, the word method of design, because I still have bad memories of that. I guess, yes.
Okay, within this somewhat history of the concept of time, how would you consider or place experiments in 3 dimensions, such as Habitat, for example, by Moshe Shafli?
Yeah, I mean,
early project by Roberto Phil, for example, which actually use the concept of time,
yeah.
but instead of repeating it in a certain way, 2-dimensionally, actually attempted, and in some cases,
Yeah.
success. Would you consider that part of the discourse that you just presented, or just a deviation?
No, I mean, it's a very good example. I mean, I have, you know, personally had a sort of a continuously changing relationship to that Moshe Safdie's project. It's a very intelligent project. It certainly was built and it worked. It didn't have a lot of consequences. It is very interesting, in fact, because it is a typology, or some aspect of that typology keep recurring, which is the terrace housing. Corbutt tried it. And I have in Argentina 2 examples, one of them built, you know, one Amancio Williams project of houses in terraces also like that, and then Antonio Bonet, who built it, and it's quite wonderful in Mar del Plata. And it just keeps on having a return. So it's an interesting struggle. And I would consider, that there is a kind of type that seems to be addressed, but it has never really flourished. I mean, it's not the type that makes an impact in the history of architecture. It's an occurrence that is called for at certain moments. It's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Yeah. Good. All right. Thank you. Thank you.